Well, you've been welcomed multiple times today, so one more time can't hurt, right? Welcome one and all, and it's just very, very good to be back here together again on a Sunday morning. In October of 2018, I stood up here and talked about which human sin is the most important. And I mentioned that Rabbi Harold Kushner was had been the representative on a clergy panel. He'd been representing the Jewish faith. And the moderator asked the panelists to do three things: to identify which of the deadly sins was the most harmful, which was the most common, and which was the hardest to avoid committing. Now, just in case the seven deadly sins aren't on the tip of your tongue, you think about them every day, let me just tick off what we're talking about here. Pride, sloth, gluttony, greed, envy, anger, and lust. An interesting collection, I must say. Now, Kushner rejected all these, said none of them amount to anything because they have no impact on the world until these thoughts are put into action. And he said what is much more important would be hurting another person, cheating another person, and shaming another person. Now today we'll flip this earlier question and move from sins to a group of behaviors that we might call virtues. I mean, many of these: honesty, kindness, generosity. But this morning I want to discuss one that has special meaning for me: humility. Next year I will discuss a second virtue that I consider very important. Now I have to confess, to discuss the topic of humility for me comes with a distinct measure of uneasiness. Because even though it's very important to me, I'm not sure if I discussing it that I don't run the risk of tending to present myself as an example of someone who possesses true humility. That is not what I wish to imply. That is not what I wish to say. My only wish this morning is to honestly discuss its importance to me. And having said that, I'm reminded of two very different quote-unquote truths concerning humility. First, all the world's great religions agree on its importance. They all do. The Buddhist works hard to diminish self-importance. The Muslim praises the greatness of Allah, not the human endeavor. Jesus constantly preached the need for humility. And then we have Micah, one of my favorite Old Testament prophets, and I've quoted him many times here. But once again, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. There it is, humility. By contrast, 2 years ago, in an editorial, Peter Marty, the publisher of Christian Century, made an interesting observation. He said, there is no shortage of people these days being humble. And he gave two examples. He cited Mike Pence, who spoke of being honored to receive remains of U.S. soldiers who had died in the Korean War when they finally returned home. And then Hillary Clinton, he mentioned, declaring that voting for herself in 2016 was a truly humbling experience. Now, Marty didn't buy this at all. He noted that speaking of being humble in this fashion is a nice way to feel immense pride, while trying to avoid being seen as prideful. Marty concluded his editorial by noting that the hymn, "Come Down, O Lord Divine," reminds us that true humility is what we wear on the inside, not what we display on the outside. Exactly. And while we're thinking along these lines, a few more thoughts occur to me. First, in addition to Jesus, the Bible is replete with talking about humility. Paul, in his letters to the Philippians, cautions, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And then we have Mr. Rogers, of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood fame. He apparently has a framed quote in his office. The quote is from Antoine Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince, and its translation is very concise, but very meaningful. The quote is this, the translation is this: the essential is invisible to the eyes. In other words, again, it's what we wear on the inside, not what we display on the outside. We have the Amish hymn, humility is the most beautiful virtue. And then we have one of our own, the Forrest Church. Wrote in his book, The Cathedral of the World, the Univer-salist Theology, he said this: in the temple of universalism, there are two great pillars, awe and humility. Now, before I go further, I must stop and acknowledge a substantial debt to a man named Eric Stanzon. Eric is a photographer and author living in Estes Park, Colorado. And he has both captured the subtlety and majesty of Rocky Mountain National Park in a wonderful book entitled Whispers in the Wilderness. The book consists of 70 photographs with a facing, very short set of comments by Stanzon. And when I began to read this book, I don't understand why I did it, but I began to make brief notes that I went through one by one. And when I got done, I looked back on these notes. And for me, at least, they seem to be giving me a very clear message. Dick, pay attention. We're confronted here with profound humility, and it resonated deeply with me. And today's message is the result of reading this book and thinking more deeply about the subject. So here we go. In the 1600s, Galileo built on the work of Copernicus and concluded that the Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. Now this was promptly declared a heresy, as it undermined the centrality of humanity. Eventually, obviously, it became undeniable. And then in 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And he made it very clear that we humans are not at the center of life forms on this planet. And in the ensuing years, our knowledge of the universe has grown enormously and is now crystal clear to anybody that pays attention that our own solar system is nowhere near the center of the cosmos. Instead, it is an infinitesimally tiny branch on one galaxy among billions, not millions, among billions of other galaxies. And every new discovery forces us to release our sense of self-importance. We once thought the world revolved around us. We're all important human beings. But now we know that we are fragile creatures living on a speck of dust in the far corner of the universe. We humans represent only a tiny twig on our own planet's vast tree of life. Do we ever think about this? Do we ever consider this? Is humility not only an appropriate response, but a necessary response? At least a few of you know my fondness for the Rocky Mountains, nurtured for more than 50 years. And our daughters and grandchildren have also fallen in love with these peaks. Now, if you look down from a distance of several thousand feet, some pretty familiar objects look pretty small. But if you're down there with them, they aren't small. So clearly our perspective is deeply influenced by where we stand. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever considered how the world looks for a cat? Or a dog? Or a horse? How about the viewpoint of a microbe? Or a spider? A fish, a bird, a giraffe, or even the Voyager, the spacecraft traveling at the edge of our solar system. Now, none of them has a false perception, but they have a limited perception. We all have a limited perception. Why? Because reality is far too complex for any one perspective to encompass it all. The cosmos appears to extend almost indefinitely on the macro scale, and we haven't seen the end yet on the micro scale. So what does this suggest? Well, I would call your attention to a book by Barry Lopez entitled Horizon. And in there he writes, mystery is the real condition in which we live, not certainty. And I agree with that. I think he's right. I would expect, in fact, I hope really, that some of us have walked the path by moonlight. But maybe, just maybe, we all at times live our own lives by moonlight. Although we try to convince ourselves that we can see clearly, there's so much about this world that remains a mystery. We often can't see, we can't even understand or express our own inner longings or our own instinctive actions. For example, why did we respond so harshly to that comment by a co-worker? Now, if we can't even understand our own behavior or our own reactions or our own beliefs, how can we be so certain that we understand others? Maybe, just maybe, the healthiest position we can take is that of humility, the recognition that we view this world by moonlight. So having briefly considered the end of the day, let's move to the beginning of the day. Have any of us watched the sunrise? I hope we have. I hope some have. I vividly remember the first time I climbed Long's Peak, a 14,000 plus foot mountain that dominates Rocky Mountain National Park. I started at 4 a.m. Why so early? Very simply because the mountain is so tall that you have to spend most of that climb well above tree line. And you just don't want to be trapped above tree line in a thunder and lightning storm. I was once, that's more than enough. More than enough. On this particular climb, my first one, I missed the sign-in register that helps rangers keep track of who's on the mountain. That was not a good beginning. I was a bad boy that morning, for sure. In the dark, I just simply never saw it. Walked right past it. But it didn't matter, fortunately. And after climbing from 9 to about 11,000 feet, I stopped as the eastern sun was beginning to lighten. And shortly the sun peeked over the horizon. I just stood still and stared. I stood there alone, transfixed, in awe of the spectacle. I am reminded of a comment by Jerry Apps, the well-known Wisconsin author, who wrote, "At times like this, I am part of something that is much larger than I am. It is a true spiritual experience." Now, this rising sun doesn't make any noise. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not looking in the right direction, you wouldn't even notice it. But its silent arrival doesn't mean that it's any less important. Our very lives and the lives of every creature on this planet depends on that sun coming up in the morning. It has important work to do, but it doesn't call attention to itself. It typically goes about its work completely unrecognized and for the most part, unappreciated, I fear, by us. And so do most of the other creatures who share our lives on this planet. For example, the pollinators, the decomposers, the denizens of a healthy soil. They don't make noise, but they're indispensable. They're indispensable. Far too often, I feel, we pay attention to the loud and the brass. And we overlook the important things and the important people who are working, taking their place quietly and humbly. Somehow we need to retune our senses and learn to turn away from the noise and focus on what is truly important. As Liberty Hyde Bailey put it, we have almost forgotten how to listen. I think he's right. We tend to miss the still small voice that ever so quietly occasionally speaks to us and then expects us to pay attention. I wonder, have some of us never heard this voice? I expect at times I've missed it, but I have heard it and have even paid attention. And my most important example of this came when I was just starting graduate school. I had a teaching assistantship in the zoology department in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I had just attended my first getting acquainted session. I woke the next morning and I knew in the most compelling way I cannot begin to explain. I knew I was in the wrong spot. I didn't belong there. I also knew, for some reason, that I belonged not in the College of Arts and Sciences, but in the College of Agriculture, in the Department of Entomology. Why? I have no idea. I didn't even know where the entomology department was. And the thought had never crossed my mind that I belonged there. So the first job I had, that voice was so compelling, there was no question I was going to look into this. So first I had to find the department. And I finally found it. Then a series of interviews, an admission that I had a teaching assistantship in the zoology department, but somehow felt I just didn't belong there. That was not where I was supposed to be. And finally, I gained the inexpressible joy of not only being admitted, but granted a research assistantship, which paid all school fees, required no teaching, and paid me the munificent sum of $196 a month. I cannot begin to explain this sequence. I have no idea what I should attribute that still small voice to, but it was absolutely compelling. I thought I had absolutely no choice. I needed to do it. Sunrises, and for that matter, sunsets, can be truly awesome. And my father loved sunsets. And our entire family does. Our family also loved waterfalls. And I never fail to wonder, when I look at a big waterfall, how can so much water keep coming down day after day, week after week, month after month? And Eric Stanslin, photographer and author that I mentioned a few minutes ago, mentioned in one of his essays that a waterfall is not like a tree or a mountain or a lake. Why? Because it is simply more ephemeral. It exists only in the moment as drops of water divide from the upper stream and tumble through the air. The drops appear for just a second or two, then they're gone. They're gone, vanished back into the larger stream from whence they came. And life is like a waterfall in some respects. Each moment comes at us so quickly, and then it's gone, never is be experienced again. We will never live that moment again, ever. We can't stop, we can't hold it, we can't control it. But these drops continue to fall into our lives. The only control we have is how we choose to respond. And much like that waterfall, when we step back and look at the whole, we realize that our fleeting lives are exquisitely beautiful, exquisitely ours. And just in case we still don't get it, in case we still don't appreciate the waterfall and the rapid rush of water both above and below the falls, there is the dipper to consider. They say, what in the world is a dipper? D-I-P-P-E-R. The dipper is a little bird, a little gray, stocky bird, about 1/2 foot long. And it's completely at home in these conditions. In fact, the dipper requires these conditions. It doesn't live anywhere else. There's no other bird like it in the world. This wonderful little bird walks and feeds and even swims beneath the waterfall. It can feed in water, it will knock a human over. And there it is, using its wings as paddles. I watch these marvelous little birds every chance I get. And I never tire of marveling at how they are so at home in conditions that we humans could not tolerate. And that dipper is just one of a million other creatures with whom we share this planet that routinely display abilities that we can't emulate, we can't produce. Let me briefly mention 2 other very different creatures. First, the Arctic fox. Fox is an astonishing creature. They weigh on an average of only 61.5 pounds, much less than many of our house cats. And they are superbly adapted to living under cold conditions. In fact, it's hard to believe, but they've been tested and they don't begin to shiver until exposed to a temperature of minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. They routinely travel hundreds of miles in search of food in their frigid conditions, in the frigid environment. And in the summer of 2017, a female fox, weighing just over 6 pounds, walked from northern Norway to northern Canada in 4 months. It traveled 2,740 miles. Think of that. Almost 3,000 miles. An average of 29 miles every day. All I can do is just shake my head in wonder and awe. And a recent United Nations report reminded us that 1 million of our planet's plant and animal species face the possibility of extinction as our planet undergoes global change. If we were to lose that many creatures, we could still be here in some shape or form, but our own experience would be much more tenuous, much less meaningful, much less enjoyable. But now, the fascinating point here is that even giving receding ice caps and disappearing permafrost, there are some creatures that are thriving given these conditions. For starters, a team led by Peter Conway, an ecologist with the British Antarctic Survey, awakened the moss. This moss had been buried for 1,500 years under Antarctic permafrost. 1,500 years to woke it up. But that was just a nap, just a brief nap. Another study unearthed a nematode, a little worm, in a Siberian permafrost. Brought it back to life, was 41,000 years old. You think about that. That little worm was living with Neanderthals. And then we have this. A variety of ancient worms have been coaxed back to life, have been buried for 1 million years. 1 million years. That's one heck of a nap. Now, I simply cannot wrap my mind around that capability. I just cannot deal with that. And speaking of life, we have hundreds of scientists searching the vastness of our universe for some signs of life, somewhere, anywhere. We haven't found it yet. We may find it If we do, it's probably a long way from us. But our own little planet is teeming with life. It's everywhere. And we haven't even discovered most of it, let alone do we understand most of it. We are rich beyond measure, and we seldom consider our good fortune. Not only are you and I objects of rare wonder, but so are the trees that grow in every shape and size, the insects, the grasses, the birds, the fish, and even the lichens that grow on rocks. And if we pay attention, when we pay attention, we recognize that life is everywhere on this wonderful planet. And none of it should be taken for granted. All life is a gift worthy of celebration. Now, I agree with John Buchanan, former editor of Christian Century, who wrote, "At times like this, poetry helps." So with that in mind, here are a few lines from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. Just 4 lines. Earth crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit still and pluck blackberries. That pretty much says it all for me. We typically take our own lives and the lives of other creatures for granted, and we seldom consider the astronomically unique circumstances that made each of these lives possible, that made our own lives possible. In a somewhat similar vein, I recall the words of the Benedictine monk, Brother David Sandergrass, who commented, "In daily life, we must see that it is not happiness that makes us grateful, but gratefulness that makes us happy." Can one be truly grateful without being deeply humble? I doubt it. I doubt it. When I consider the indescribable beauty and wealth of our planet, when I remember there are millions of other creatures gifted with extension of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear, then I understand that we are fragile creatures living on a speck of dust in a far corner of the universe. How should I view my life? I can't speak for any of you. The only answer that makes any sense to me is acknowledgement of profound humility. I can't imagine any more reasonable response.